Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Christina Michaud. I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see this?
We don't see it yet.
Okay, hold on. Let me. Strange. I feel like we tested this. Sorry. Okay, one more time. Okay, did that work?
Yes, it looks great.
Great. Okay. So, Marnie, do you want to just say hello?
Yeah, hello, everyone. So this is Marnie Reed. I'm a professor of language education at the new Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. And it's really wonderful to be here and to see you all. Thank you.
Yeah. We have a question to start out with, and maybe everyone could just type this in the chat for right now. So would you rather give an hour-long formal presentation at a high-stakes conference in your field to a potentially large audience, or, again, imagining a conference situation, chat informally with colleagues in your field from many different institutions at a refreshment break? Think about which one you'd rather do and why, and just type that in the chat as people are still coming in and joining us. And this is also a way of making sure that everyone knows where the chat is. So if we ask things later on, people will see them. So I'm seeing Paige saying the latter, so the informal chat. Marcy also said informal chat. So while other people are thinking about this, let me just say that we are sharing our slides with you all, and you can use this QR code if it's helpful to you, but the link is also in the Whova app right at the bottom of our description, so that you can either follow along for accessibility purposes now, or you can go back to them for reference afterwards. So it is in the Whova app, or you can get to them this way as well.
So everyone seems to prefer the chat, and some very good explanations are being given. Less pressure, fun, get responses quickly, easier to share ideas. So thank you for elaborating your reasons.
These are great. So I'll tell you that I often ask this question to students that I'm teaching in pronunciation classes. And in general, more than 3/4 of the students would rather give the hour-long formal presentation. So the opposite of what you all were saying, and that might feel potentially counterintuitive at times. And I'll just tell you, these are BU students, both undergrad and grad, and we've asked them this at different points over the past year. But anyone have any ideas why students would be saying this, why they would be picking that option? And you can type this, or you can unmute yourself and just tell us what your thoughts are here if you'd like.
If you unmute yourself, it'd be lovely if you tell us who you are when you comment.
So I'm seeing Bonnie Esther, because they can practice, memorize, get feedback, control. Holly says they can prepare. So definitely, that is what students say. They say they can practice, they have preparation strategies. Some of them also cite anxiety, specifically either social anxiety or speaking anxiety. They talk a lot about memorization, that maybe they memorize their entire talk and then try to make it sound not memorized, but they really do memorize it. They talk about a worry about small talk, worry about idioms, confidence, and really wanting to make sure that things are restricted to known topics.
Mm-hmm.
So typically when we start and I'm talking with students about pronunciation, this is, as you can see, a very anxiety-provoking topic for many students. So often in a class setting, I do start with some kind of grounding exercise. And we can all do that now if you'd wish. Just kind of be aware for the moment of your body, of where it is. Feel the floor or the chair. Just take a deep breath in and out. Kind of be aware of your mouth, your jaw. This is so important when thinking about pronunciation. So we know that students need to use their mouths, right? They need to use their body. Often there are paralinguistics even that accompany pronunciation. So it's partly in their head, it's partly in their mouth, it's partly in their body. And I like to tell students to get ready to play with language. So just as a way of getting started. So we'll give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to do today. So we're going to start with a little background and kind of a really quick theoretical lens. And then we're going to get into some of the practical problems and talk about some of the suprasegmental solutions to this and the critical reflections that are really key for having this approach coming out of critical language awareness and linguistic justice to accompany pronunciation instruction. And I'll say that all of the materials that we're sharing with you, you can adapt and adopt and share with students. So some of them are clearly specifically student facing, but you can share them with students or colleagues in any way. And if you have just joined us, again, our slides are available in the Whova app right at the bottom of the description there. So you can get to them now or after the conference as well. Marnie, do you want to talk a little bit about our work just as an introduction to where we're coming from?
Right, so Christina and I have been collaborating for a couple of decades, I think, at this point. We were interested in listening and speaking pedagogy, as you can see here, the critical language awareness and so forth. Our first major collaboration resulted in a 2005 student textbook followed by a 2006 teacher manual to accompany this that looks at what we think are the four major areas of speaking and pronunciation. That is the segmentals, the consonants and vowels, the suprasegmentals, the melody and prosody, connected speech features, and things that maybe teachers often don't connect with pronunciation, but that would be things like noun and verb endings or the grammatical stuff. So we began a sort of integrated approach that is reflected in the title. And Christina, you can talk about the fellowship work that you have done.
So BU has a Center for Anti-Racist Research, which is run by Ibram X. Kendi. And for the past year, I've been working with them really intensively on developing anti-racist and linguistically just language instruction, specifically for English language learners at the college level, but certainly applicable beyond the university setting as well. And so it's within this framework that we wanted to talk to you today. So we have divided this slide up for you here, thinking about the theoretical and research background. And on the left of the screen, you'll see a quote from Shauna Shapiro, who's in Middlebury College, thinking about critical language awareness. And on the right, you've got some quotes and sources and summary there, synthesis of work coming out of contemporary prosody studies. And we feel that these are really two sides of the same issue, the same approach, that they complement each other so very well, and that we can't really do one without the other. So you can see if we're looking at the right, that as Marnie said, we really need to be thinking about suprasegmentals. But there also is this idea of student awareness, which then brings us right back to connect on the left to critical language awareness, these self-reflection issues here, and then thinking about different kinds of input, which we'll talk with you more about, and different ways of visualization of this. And so Shauna Shapiro talks a lot about what she identifies as the tension between pragmatism, what students need for now, and progressivism, what the world needs for a more just tomorrow. And we do see that tension is present in a lot of pronunciation instruction, and we would like to address it sort of head on in our work with learners. So the problem with thinking about pronunciation very narrowly, and I tell students this explicitly, what our work is not accent reduction, and it is not deficit focused. And we really want to approach this from the perspective of being aware of issues of linguicism, being aware of the discrimination that students may face based on the way they sound when they speak. And so we know that many non-native speakers may face discrimination in social institutions and further. So this is kind of underlying some of our work here. But we recognize the rights of all speakers to their own identities, languages, accents, and choices, and the intersections of racism, sexism, and linguicism, especially on students of color and students of marginalized genders, because especially when you start thinking about gender, on top of everything here, there are certain kinds of intonation patterns that are more associated with women, for example. And I could also add age here. Certain things are more associated with younger generations. We recognize the unfair burdens placed on multilingual speakers of English in academic settings and beyond. And of course, we know that communication is a two-way street. We sometimes think about a seesaw, that it can't be kind of completely on one side or the other, or scales. And we have some additional readings down there for you if you would like to follow up on them. But even while recognizing these things, we don't feel that the end result is just to stop addressing pronunciation. We want to address students' pronunciation, and we want to offer them strategies for improving their speech, because we believe that intelligibility is power. So if students can make themselves be understood, they can empower themselves. And so even while thinking that, yes, this is placing the burden of communication on multilingual speakers, and so this is that problem between pragmatism and progressivism. If I'm faced with a room of multilingual students who want to be better understood so that they can get that teaching assistantship, so that they can give the presentation in their field, so that they can make a compelling argument as to why they deserve a promotion, I want to be able to give them some specific strategies that they can work on to make their English more intelligible to others. And we really are thinking about intelligibility here as a construct. Marnie, do you want to talk about that as the construct there? And
yes, so we've quoted here the work by Murray Monroe, and we could also mention his constant or frequent collaborator, Tracy Derwing, who set this distinction between accent and intelligibility. And so the field has moved away, in the research field, we have moved completely away from accent reduction into this notion of intelligibility that empowers in all the ways that Christina just described it. So the field is, the scholarship base is there. And a lot of what Christina and I and others have been doing recently in conference presentations, webinars, and so forth, is trying to bridge this research to practice gap so that individuals in the field also think about intelligibility over accent reduction. So we're beyond the native speaker model. The Jennifer Jenkins quote that was on the slide before this set that tone. There are more non-native speakers in the world speaking English to other non-native speakers than to native speakers. So the field is completely divorced from trying to promote a native speaker ideal.
definitely. And when we think about this, when we think about that question that we began with, and we want students to feel empowered to participate in that small talk, in the sometimes where a lot of important networking happens, we think about the things that students need to be able to do. We want them to be able to share their research, experience communicative success, maybe make new friends, make themselves understood, become better listeners, both actually technically as far as processing the speech input, And also as far as thinking about, okay, well, now what's the implication of what was said to me? And then ultimately feeling comfortable speaking even when unscripted. So with that in mind, we've identified some different challenges to effective pronunciation instruction. And some of these are metacognitive, some of them are linguistic, some are social and affective variables. We know that there are fossilized patterns. We know that some students might have a resistance to change. And that there might be maybe risk aversion, learner self-consciousness, so all of these things come into play here. But while holding these in mind, I think what's really been a shift in our thinking now, as opposed to when Marnie and I started working together over 20 years ago, is thinking about building in more time for learners to reflect on these things and to think about the power dynamics at play in these different situations. So we're going to move into talking about what pronunciation looks like in ways that we would actually share with students. And then at different points in our presentation, we're going to pause and show you some of the reflections that we use with students. And depending on how we're going for time, we'll invite people to type in the chat or unmute themselves as well and jump right in. Marnie, do you want to?
Okay, so when we think about pronunciation, we think of these major areas. We think of this pronunciation, the term, as a kind of umbrella term. It encompasses the speaking and the listening. And then we talk about what features really matter. These two are two reverse sides of the same coin. There's a little note down here under listening. And last year at the TESOL conference, I was interviewed for the book on listening in the classroom that had just been published. So you're welcome to look at that link. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Christina.
We can break speaking skills down further, of course, into segmentals, so the individual consonant and vowel sounds, and suprasegmentals. This seems like a fairly straightforward division here, but what research tells us is that most learners cannot list more than one or two specific pronunciation challenges. And when they can list their challenges, they tend to think that they need work on those segmentals. So they might say, oh yes, L and R, that's it, that's what I need to work on. Or a Spanish speaker might say, well, vowels, I need to work on my vowel sounds. But we know from the research that suprasegmental, so the rhythm and music, the prosody of the language, have a far greater effect on speaker intelligibility than do segmentals. And so therefore focusing our pronunciation instruction on suprasegmentals has the highest return for intelligibility. And I would say this is something that I definitely share with students at every level. I tell them this. And first of all, it tells them that they're not alone in their challenges. And it also helps refocus them to the spot where they're going to get the biggest payoff as far as increasing their intelligibility. So research also tells us that when students have unrealistic ideas of what it means to improve their pronunciation, meaning they want to sound like a native speaker, for example, that can make the project feel daunting and even threatening to their identity. But again, if we are focused really clearly on certain suprasegmental patterns, and we're giving them very clear strategies, then we think we can manage to improve their intelligibility without affecting their identity in a negative way as a multilingual speaker. And so that's really the key here. Marnie, do you want to talk through suprasegmentals in more detail?
I'll just mention one thing. Maybe a quick example is illustrative. Supposing I use the word vocabularies. And you may be puzzling, what is a vocabulary? This happened at a conference I attended recently, a few years ago. So here we can think about, where does this rhythm or music or melody of the language begin? Well, it begins at the word level. So vocabulary is maybe a 5-syllable word, but if you put the stress on the wrong one, then the listener, especially the native speaker listener, may not realize that you're talking about vocabulary. So there was a segmental error. Some learners will transpose V and W and say W instead of V, but that doesn't matter. Even if I keep the segmental error, and even if I pluralize a word that's not typically plural, if I don't get the stress right and I say vocabulary, you're still lost. So the stress really matters, and it begins at the word level, lexical stress. So for students, so when I think about work that I do with learners, I will basically tell them, what are the words you have to use when you have to use English? It might be in an academic setting, what is your major? In a professional, what is your field? What are the terms that you have to use? In a community setting, it might be when you're forced in a situation to use English, what words do you want to use? For those words, students need to know how many syllables are there in that word and which one gets the primary stress. If they can nail the primary, all else will follow. The same principles that are true for lexical stress are true for standard phrases. So we always say something like, in the first place, da 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 da, it's always the same. It's a fixed rhythm pattern. So what applies for lexical stress applies as well for standard phrases or preposition phrases. And then that extends to the sentence level and so forth. And then what students don't seem to pay attention to is extra stress and extra intonation. And the example that Christina and I use often, because it happened in Christina's class, a student may ask, teacher, can I turn in my assignment late? And the teacher might say, you can, to which the student may reply, oh, thank you, with great relief. They're attending to the words, they're paying attention to the words, they're not necessarily attending to the accompanying stress, including extra stress and intonation. So if it all just sounds like it's too up and down, it's too sing-songy, they need to realize that yes, English does use a wide range of pitch in its ordinary everyday conversation, but when we use extra pitch or extra intonation, then there's a purpose, and it could be to convey a contrast or to make an implication.
Excellent, thank you. So out of those, we're going to focus in on 3 specific areas. So as Marnie said, this all begins at the level of the word. We're going to focus in on syllables and stress in words. We're going to think about content and function words with standard sentence level stress and intonation. And then we're going to think about that extra stress and intonation and how it has, it can help us make contrasts or imply. And so these are there are certainly more things we could talk to students about, but if we're going to do like a greatest hits or a 3 key things to start with, these would be them. So if we're going to start by thinking about words, Marnie, you had already mentioned this. Do you want to talk through this?
Yes, sure. So there was a scholar named John Murphy and his co-author Magdi Kandil, who did a study of a corpus, a 2,000 word corpus. And from that corpus, they analyzed how many multisyllabic words are there. And for those multisyllabic words, what are the stress patterns? What they came up with was something unwieldy because, and this is something we think students need to know, stress. So first of all, English, unlike other languages in the world, does alternate strong and weak, or you could call them stressed and unstressed syllables. And that alternation begins as soon as you get 2 syllables back to back. They are either strong, weak, like student, teacher, paper, or they're weak, strong, like above, below, beyond, etc. And so because there are multiple stress patterns and they are not predictable, a student won't necessarily know where the primary stress falls in a new word that the student learns. What we recommend came out of the Magdi Kandil and John Murphy work, and that was to help students take note of and pay attention to and learn for these keywords that they have to use, how many syllables, which one gets the primary stress. The Murphy and Kandil article basically used a number of syllables followed by which one gets the primary stress system, because they were analyzing a corpus. You might prefer in your work to think of it in another way. So vocabulary, 1, 2, 3, 4. You might want to teach your students 2 in 4. We think that when you go to do an error correction, the student mispronounces vocabulary. The typical method, I think, is to just provide the correction and model it. But that's ephemeral, in one ear, out the other. A more useful thing for students to adopt is a system where they can record for those words that they have to know, how many syllables, where's the primary stress. And then you, if you introduce it in your classroom, can abandon just providing a model in the future and then tell your students, oh, it's a 2-4 word or whatever it is. And then they can figure it out themselves.
So you can see at the bottom here, we gave you 3 examples, and these are high frequency words in an academic setting that multilingual students often mispronounce at the level of syllables and stress. So often students will say majority with a stress on the first syllable, or economics with a stress on the second, etc. And in many cases, this is completely understandable. So an economist, the person, has the stress on that second syllable, but economics, the field, has that stress on the third syllable. So what I typically do on the first day that I'm with any group of students, and whether this is graduate students or whether this is community learners in a church basement, I might be having them introduce themselves or just talk a little bit. And I'm keeping track of words, and I'm writing down words they say. And these might be words they mispronounce, or they might just be words they say correctly, but I'm keeping track of multisyllabic words that they say that I know are going to be important in their speech. So I've been working with an Afghan woman, so a recent immigrant, and she really needs to be able to say the words absent and appointment, because she's talking to teachers about her daughter. And so she wants to be able to say, my daughter will be absent tomorrow. She has a doctor's appointment. So she needs words like that. And when the stress is wrong in those words, when it is misplaced, it becomes very challenging for someone to understand her. So whatever the words are, we suggest starting with words that come out of learners' own speech, and then teaching them the way you make a stressed syllable is these 4 different things. The stressed syllable is louder, it is longer, clearer, and higher in pitch. And it has to actually pop out of the word. And so we might give students these different kind of learning strategies in order to practice syllable stress. So they might need to stretch out a rubber band, because if you don't lengthen the syllable, you don't have enough time to change your pitch on it. So we might ask students to mark it up on the page, or to maybe hum it or sing it, to think about, like, even the word syllable, strong, weak, to think about that. So we ask learners, okay, so who sings, who plays an instrument, and kind of think about that. Okay, well, let's think about the rhythm of this word, the music of this word. And oftentimes learners, when they start acquiring stress in words, they'll acquire it very asymmetrically. So they might at first be very loud and not yet long. And that's obviously not where they need to be. That's not target-like yet, but it is a step in the right direction. They're identifying the syllable that needs the stress, and they're using one of the markers. And so then we can talk about, okay, well, now you need to lengthen it. Whereas there might be students who lengthen it, but the intonation doesn't change at all. It's lengthened, but it's all flat. And that is also very challenging to understand. So we might give students something like this. So after that first day, we might ask them, so what are some keywords or names. And so often these are names, like for graduate students, your advisor's name. For my Afghan woman, she needs to be able to say her doctor's name and her dentist's name. So when she shows up at the reception desk, she can say her name. But then sometimes they say, oh, who was your appointment with? And then if she cannot answer them and say the name of her doctor with syllables and stress that match what the receptionist is expecting to hear, there's a complete breakdown in communication there. And so we ask students to practice this and maybe keep a log of this. So this is our first pause point here. And this is something that we ask learners to do. So we might ask them to imagine someone with excellent English pronunciation, and we would keep that deliberately vague at first, and first ask them to flesh that out. What does that mean to you? And then think about, what does this person look like? What do they sound like? So if you would like to, put something in the chat at the moment, or just, again, you're welcome to unmute yourself. I believe everyone has that capability. Unmute yourself and tell us either what you imagine or what you think your students would say if you gave them this. What are they going to say? Who do they imagine as someone with excellent English pronunciation?
A news reporter.
Okay.
Yeah. This is an interesting one. Yeah.
Someone who makes no mistakes. Yeah.
Right.
Newscasters. Right. So sometimes students also say their teachers, when they're thinking about this. Often it comes out that they are thinking of native speakers of English and a British person, maybe, like they're thinking of someone who's educated. So often they are thinking of a white person, maybe even a white native speaker of English for this. And I think breaking down for students who they think about here and why is potentially very interesting. And that brings us to what Marnie was mentioning previously. And I, again, share this with students. We talk about the large number of people in the world who speak English and the comparatively smaller number of people who speak English as their first or only language. And I do this in part to shake up their image of someone who speaks excellent English and a wonderful speaker, and say, look, it doesn't have to be this white native speaker of English to enlarge this effort there.
Can I mention also that one of the big areas in the field is what is called high variability phonetic input. And so we always recommend listen to more speakers, a variety of speakers, including non-native speakers of English. And one of the interesting studies that was done was looking at a movie star. I think his name was Bardez or something, but I'm not a moviegoer, so I don't know. But at any rate, someone clearly speaking with an accent and completely intelligible. So that's a good way to demonstrate that these two things of accent and intelligibility are divorced. Yeah,
absolutely. Let's move on to our second spotlight area here. So we're moving from the level of the word up to the level of the phrase or sentence. And again, with students, this would be slowed down. You do lots of practices, contextualize, etc. One construct that we like to use to help convey this to students is the idea of content words versus function words. And just thinking about the way that standard English speech works, we tend to stress the content words more than the function words. So we tend to stress the nouns and the verbs, for example, even the adjectives, more than the prepositions and the articles and the auxiliaries. And so we also would be able to talk, when students are talking about pronunciation in sentences, we'll be able to talk about standard intonation in sentences, which might go down a little bit at the end of a thought group. So a group of words that go together, and then maybe a little bit more at the end of a whole sentence. So you could imagine, and this was a graduate student who I said, so I was seeing them just the week after spring break, and I'm like, what did you do over spring break? And they said, I caught up on sleep, worked on my CV, and revised a paper. Except when the students said it, it didn't quite have that same intonation contour. And we would expect it to be, thing A, a little bit of a drop, thing B, a little bit of a drop, and thing C. You would expect a little bit of a bigger drop there. This weekend, so stress on the content word, I'm going to prepare for that conference and celebrate my roommate's birthday. And we would expect probably some kind of stepping down there at the end. So especially for learners who have some amount of metalinguistic awareness, learners who have maybe an academic background and are comfortable kind of parsing sentences grammatically, we tell them that they can use grammar and punctuation to help them have some tips about where their intonation should hold steady and where it should fall down. And we are a big proponent in giving learners checklists and strategies for them to use to help themselves. So we might give them a checklist like this. Marnie, do you want to talk through this?
Okay, so what are the things that you should do at the word level? Tricky names, again, how many syllables, which one gets the primary stress? But at the sentence level, timing and pausing. So Judy Gilbert, a pioneer in our field, uses the phrase thought groups. You can just think of these as chunks around which you would pause. Sometimes the punctuation reflects these pauses, but very often it doesn't. But nevertheless, these usually represent grammatical constituents like noun phrases and verb phrases and preposition phrases. And then pausing at punctuation, so we can look at the difference between a semicolon and a sentence final period and so forth. And then sentence level focus. What is the normal level of stress, and what is something that's a little bit different? So we've mentioned things like holding intonation when you have items in a series and so forth.
Yeah. And so students really like an approach like this because it is iterative. It shows them they don't have to be able to do everything all at once. They can make multiple passes. Especially as we talked about at the beginning, we know that students really like to prepare before they have an oral presentation or a high stakes situation. So this is a way that we can help focus their energy on preparing that is not just endlessly repeat, memorize, repeat, in a way that is really, really targeting some of these specific aspects of pronunciation. So for this pause point, I think we're not going to do this necessarily ourselves, but I would definitely ask my learners this. I would ask them, have you ever tried to teach pronunciation of part of your language to a native speaker of English? So let's try it. So you're going to go out and you're going to find someone, this lab mate, this friend, whoever, and you're going to teach them something. And I want you then to ask them how they felt about it. And I want you to think about how you felt about it. So I think that this is a key aspect here of thinking about critical language awareness and thinking a little bit about the power differential involved in this. So trying to unpack, so from Shauna Shapiro, student assumptions about English speech features, to try to get them to use reverse instruction for them to start thinking about, well, what's important here? What do I need to say? What are people not paying attention to in my language that they should be? And how does that make a difference for me as a listener? And then maybe starting for them to think about it from the other point of view. So what are people telling me in English that I'm not paying attention to, but I should? And oh, interesting, it could be similar to this feature over here. So our third spotlight area is really, as Marnie was talking about, this idea of extra stress and intonation in order to show focus or to make contrasts. And so we can think about it as technically like the implicational fall-rise pattern. But again, I don't know that students necessarily need to know that. At many levels, they just need to know that it's extra stress. So if regular stress is stress syllables are louder, longer, clearer, and higher in pitch, extra stress is extra loud, extra long, extra clear and extra high in pitch. And here are some of the examples that Marnie was talking through before, if you want to address them.
Right. So a sentence like, should I take the economics section before lunch? Well, the implication there is before or after. Or someone spelling a person's name where they're pausing in between. They gave the example of, can I do it while you can? What students often don't recognize is that by tuning in to this kind of intonation, you can actually anticipate things that might come next in a sentence. So,
yeah. So we think that the extra stress and intonation really are key to effective listening and speaking. And as Marnie said, they can help students, working on them can improve their intelligibility and improve their speaking, their pronunciation, but they can also improve their listening. So you can imagine someone who is giving a lecture here, and they might say, last week, we talked about the causes of World War II. Today, we're going to talk about the progress of World War II. So it's this standard way of putting stress on this would stress causes and progress in those sentences because they are the contrast here. So someone is setting up this contrast. But let's imagine a second scenario. So if someone says, last week we talked about the causes of World War II. Today we're going to talk about the causes of the Cold War. So that would be a little bit surprising if the person stressed causes in both. We'd probably stress the causes of World War II. And today we're going to talk about the causes of the Cold War. So what we have found is that this is something that is generally not taught to students, to learners. They are not aware of this. And this is both learners at the community level. These are learners high up, academic learners. They tend not to be aware of this at all, that the people who are speaking are giving them information. And so one way that I explain this is, let's say you're listening to a talk and someone says, last week we talked about the causes of World War II. Today we're going to talk about the blah, blah, blah. And then like the person next to you, opens their bag and there's a big zipper and you miss what they're saying. You miss the word there. You still have some sense of prediction based on where the stress was in that first sentence. So we might ask students to think about the connections from one clause to the next, and then let them, as speakers, have them help the extra stress and intonation, help their listener start to find out where the pattern is.
let me say two things here, if I may. In a recent language lab where I was doing some observing, the students were actually practicing this kind of contrastive stress. As I watched the students doing this, what I noticed was they were rolling their eyes and they were just looking at each other and exchanging kind of meaningful chuckles. But they put up with it. They did the activity in the class. I asked if I could just go in the following week and just do a little activity. And what I did was take the one sentence where they had been forced to produce this kind of contrastive stress without, I should say, understanding quite why they were doing it. And then I asked them, what will be the topic of the next sentence? And the students could not answer that. They basically said, how would we know what the topic of the next sentence is until we hear it? And the answer, as Christina just said, is because if you pay attention to, we're going to talk about the causes of something, then the next sentence is going to be about causes, not about some other war. So the key here is to not only have the students practice these, but make sure that they understand, as measured by, can they articulate why, that it's drawing your attention to the speaker's intention, to the meaning And the second thing I'll just say briefly is that most of the surveys in this area indicate that when teachers are working on intonation, very often they're focusing on the affective or emotive. So here are 10 sentences. Student number 1, read this sentence, pretend you're frustrated. So student number 2, read this other sentence, pretend you're happy. And so, and the research says that even native speakers can't predict, affect based on this intonation. So the takeaway, not only do these kinds of exercises, but make sure that the students can articulate why. What is the point of all of this super exaggerated intonation that they may feel awkward actually trying to do at first, although they can do it very well if they want to mimic. How do Americans sound?
So the next few slides we've got here for you are examples of reflections that we might give to learners. So this is a very kind of meta-linguistic type of reflection where they're actually thinking through specific features and maybe going through like a little internal checklist here, some kind of inventory. And, again, this is not necessary that they don't. We're not saying you must do all of them. We're saying research has shown us that these things do positively help intelligibility. And of course, it's up to students, to individual learners and speakers, whether they adopt them or not, but they can start to reflect on them. We can then add in this level of critical reflections, where we ask them to think about what feels uncomfortable about what we've discussed, or what feels like there's a moment when power differentials are not perfectly shared, and how might something that we've discussed help them navigate one of those situations. And so again, the reality is that almost all of the learners that I work with are people of color. Almost all of them are in situations where they are petitioning in some way. They're trying to get people to give them something, the better job, the interview, the whatever it is. And so they are often in these situations where they do not have more power. And so thinking about the way that language works in these situations is really important. We can also ask learners to kind of think back and kind of be able to tell us something that we've worked on, set kind of a short-term goal, so within the next week, and then maybe set like a longer-term goal. So, focus on specific features of the language that they're going to be working on. And then as far as helping them set goals, we might model some examples of goals that they might have. So maybe that pronunciation log, so thinking about individual words. For example, a student who lives in a certain neighborhood in Boston needs to be able to say the name of that neighborhood or their town with a certain kind of stress. Or I had a student who told me that they had lived in Binghamton and they'd gone to Binghamton. And I had no idea what they were talking about, and working really hard. And I said, where's that? New York? Eventually, it was SUNY Binghamton. And so that's a case where the student was very proud of where they had studied English and wanted to tell everyone they'd gone to SUNY Binghamton. But if the stress is misplaced and then people get derailed, it becomes a very frustrating situation for the learner. One here that I'd like to highlight is the third bullet down, this idea of shadowing or mirroring. And those are links to videos and additional resources explaining how to do that. If those are techniques that you are not familiar with, we tell students explicitly the speaker does not have to be a native speaker, again, as Marnie was talking about. So the next slide has some high-tech resources that you can also share with students, and I'll let Marnie talk through those.
Okay, so English Accent Coach, this is an interactive one, and you can see here some of the people who created this. Ron Thompson, who is an advocate of high variability phonetic input. In other words, making sure that students are listening to a high variety of speakers. This is something where the students can actually improve their pronunciation, and all of these are free and downloadable. The POSE test, Perception of Spoken English, this is more of a diagnostic tool. It was developed by a master's student, and it's very useful. If you use nothing else, I highly recommend Youglish. Youglish works this way. You type in either a word or a phrase and hit, submit. And what it will propagate or generate is samples in which someone is using that word or using that phrase, and one type in might generate over 100 or 1,000 of these. So you want to make sure your students don't get bogged down in watching all the videos. These could come from TED Talks, TV programs, movies, podcasts, a wide variety of sources. So you hear the same word or the same phrase spoken in a variety of ways, so that this can improve learners' ability to, they see what it is, now how does it sound? And the last one, Prot, this was the work of we can see the developers here. This will provide the spectrograms. So Christina has been telling you that the stressed vowel or the vowel in a stressed syllable is longer. Prot will allow a speaker to say a word and then compare that with other speakers. And you can actually see the physical dimensions. Let's say the difference between the word permit, you need a permit, versus the verb to permit. So those two words are identical in spelling, identical in syllable structure, but the noun has greater temporal duration on the first syllable, and you will actually see that. Christina mentioned also that if you don't lengthen a stressed syllable or the vowel in a stressed syllable, it's impossible to superimpose the pitch contour on top of it. So Prot will show you the pitch line, and along the y-axis, it will show you the decibels. What is the increase in decibels on the vowel and the stressed syllable? So very, very useful diagnostically that way.
So this next slide, so we're not going to click through to them right now, but just to tell you, so this top link here is teaching tips videos collected by John Levis and some of his colleagues and collaborators. And the bottom one is maybe the first in a series of short form videos Marnie is recording, and more are coming this month. Marnie, is that right?
That's correct.
Yes. So these are examples of things that you could even have students make, or you could record some of your own. And so we haven't yet branched out into putting them on TikTok, but it is just a small step toward that. So I think since we're running short on time, we'll keep going and then we'll pause for questions. So closing our rationale. So why this all matters. Basically, it is not just the pronunciation content itself, but it is the way that we present this. And so this is an email that I received in March of this year from a couple of graduate students who saw a workshop on pronunciation being offered on campus. And they had a very visceral reaction to it. And they said, we don't know the structure of this workshop, but they were concerned that it might perpetuate linguistic racism. We recognize that elective accent modification can be beneficial in certain contexts. However, minoritized groups regularly experience bias. And so this is, of course, where we began. And I was able to kind of write to them and say, well, look at the description of the talk. Yes, I agree. This is where I'm coming from. We're on the same page here. But I think that sometimes when people hear pronunciation instruction, this is what they think. They think you're trying to take away my accent, my identity. You're trying to make me sound just like you. And for a field where instructors, teachers may still be predominantly white, maybe even predominantly female, and native speakers, and working with students of color, it is a very, very fraught situation. And I think assuring students that we hear where they're coming from, that we can work together and we can help them is really important. So these are now things that students have said after going through workshops where we've done this kind of critical reflective approach. So they've talked about having a nice environment looking at videos from speakers who are also international. So they said it's always respectful. No one makes fun of my accent. Some of them are focused on kind of the specific actual outcomes there. So really thinking about the things that no one told them before. And again, that's where we began, that strategies are power, that by giving students this content, we are empowering them. And this is now our checklist for you. So just as we gave students a checklist, this would be a checklist for instructors. So do your lesson plans and pronunciation materials. Teach the whole learner. And remember, we began from the beginning with that grounding exercise. And we began by thinking about situations where people feel more or less comfortable. Do my lesson plans foreground multilingualism and de-emphasize native speaker privilege? Include reflections on self, society, and other communicative contexts. Focus on the suprasegmentals and vary the mode and type of activities. And we hope that we've built in for you, we've given you ways that you can enrich your resources and build in critical reflections of your own. So I'm going to stop here, and I think we have a few minutes for questions. You can type them in the chat, you can use the Q&A, or you can unmute and ask.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colleen Desiree. I work for Boston Public Schools, and I found this possibly the most important workshop for me today, because I see this happening, especially with the last connection you made. I think it is so true, especially for Black people. You may come being highly intelligent and speak very well, as long as you don't have that accent, then people, they block the listening process. So how do we stop some of the educators to stop, to think critically regarding this pronunciation, and to ensure that we're not promoting racism or subconsciously, I guess, promoting white supremacy?
Yeah, that is such a good question. Thank you so much for asking that. I mean, I think this is the job, right? This is the task. I will say that actually what we're also trying to do is to lead a series of workshops for our colleagues and students on campus who are not multilingual, to try to talk about the importance of communication as a two-way street and kind of thinking beyond the surface level of these errors or the accent that grabs people's attention. But I think definitely thinking about the role of the teacher here is so important. Yeah.